Chicago, 1967. The air was thick with smoke, perfume, and secrets. Inside a dimly lit nightclub on the south side, a woman's voice cut through the haze. She sang not just with her throat, but with her soul, a velvet tremor that made men shift uneasily in their seats and women glance with suspicion at the way their husbands leaned forward. Her name was Clara Duval. She was young, beautiful, dangerous. And in the back corner, his tie loosened and his glass of whiskey untouched, sat Mayor Richard Callahan, Chicago's most powerful man. A man the city saw as untouchable. A family man. A Catholic. A symbol of control in a city drowning in crime and corruption. But that night, under the red glow of a neon sign, the mayor wasn't thinking of politics. He was thinking of Clara. And that was the beginning of a scandal that would shake Chicago to its core. Before we go deeper into this story, if you're watching right now, take a second to subscribe to the channel. These are the stories power tried to bury, the scandals history tried to forget. And as you listen, tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? Because this story may be Chicago's, but the shadows of lust and betrayal, they stretch across every city in America. To understand the affair, you must first understand the man. Richard Callahan wasn't born into power. He had clawed his way up from the Irish ghettos of the South Side, a second-generation immigrant who knew hunger, cold winters, and the sting of being told he would never belong. Chicago in the 1920s had been run by gangs and ward bosses, and Callahan had learned young that if you wanted something in this city, you either bought it, stole it, or bled for it. By 1967, Callahan was in his mid-40s, sharp-jawed, broad-shouldered, and always dressed in dark suits that made him look like part politician, part mobster. His speeches electrified working men. His deals made the wealthy richer. And his control stretched into every alley, every boardroom, every union hall in Chicago. He had a wife, Margaret Callahan. Elegant, composed, and for years, the perfect political partner. Together they looked like the picture of respectability. But anyone who knew the truth understood theirs was not a marriage of love. It was a marriage of survival. And when Richard first saw Clara Duval, singing under that nightclub spotlight, something inside him cracked. Clara was 25. She had grown up in Louisiana and had drifted north chasing the promise of music. By the mid-60s, she had carved a niche in Chicago's nightclub scene, not famous enough to be national, but magnetic enough that men with money came back night after night to hear her sing. She was dangerous not because of her beauty, though she had plenty of it, but because of her hunger. Clara had clawed her way out of poverty, and she wasn't about to let it swallow her again. She had lovers, wealthy ones. But each of them served a purpose. Each of them brought her closer to the life she believed she deserved. And when her eyes locked with the mayor's across that smoke-filled club, she knew instantly, this was no ordinary man. This was a man who could open every door she'd ever dreamed of. For weeks, Callahan returned to that club. Always late. Always alone. At first, he kept his distance. Watching. Listening. But Chicago is a city of whispers, and soon Clara knew who the man in the shadows was. She didn't wait for him to come to her. After her set one night, she approached his table herself. Witnesses later said the mayor looked like a schoolboy the first time she spoke to him, all his confidence melting into awkward fascination. That night they talked for an hour. The next week, for 2. By the end of the month, they were meeting in hotel rooms under false names. For Richard, Clara was more than an affair. She was an escape. From the wife who had long stopped loving him. From the weight of politics. From the endless grind of being the man everyone feared but no one really knew. For Clara, Richard was a ticket. Money. Power. A future she couldn't build on her own. But in Chicago, no secret stays hidden forever. Margaret Callahan had been married to Richard for nearly 20 years. She had raised his children, attended his fundraisers, smiled at his side through every campaign. But Margaret was not naive. She knew the whispers. She knew the nights he didn't come home. Still, she had accepted it. That was the bargain they had struck. Her life was one of wealth and influence, and in exchange, she turned her face from his sins. But when Richard met Clara, things were different. His absence grew longer. His excuses grew thinner. His obsession bled into every corner of his life. For the first time, Margaret felt not just betrayed, but replaced. And that, she could not allow. By 1967, Chicago's politics was a beast fed on secrets. Every man in City Hall had dirt on the others, and Richard's allies were quick to notice his distraction. Clara became the subject of whispers in the smoky backrooms where aldermen cut deals and mobsters shook hands. The danger wasn't just that Richard was having an affair. The danger was that Clara was ambitious. She wasn't content to be a hidden mistress. She wanted more. A house, money, recognition. And if she didn't get it, she might talk. One night, in the gilded office of a downtown hotel, Richard confronted her. He told her she had to keep quiet. She told him she wouldn't be silenced. And then, she said something that froze him. A secret. One so dangerous that if it ever reached the press, his career would burn overnight. No one knows exactly what Clara told him that night. Some said it was about money he had laundered through city contracts. Others said it was about the mob bosses he had cut deals with. Still others claimed it was more personal, that she was carrying his child. Whatever the truth was, one thing is certain. From that moment on, the affair was no longer about lust. It was about survival. Richard Callahan was a man who could fight unions, silence the press, even bend the law to his will. But Clara had found the one weapon no one else in Chicago had. She had found his weakness. And she wasn't afraid to use it. On a cold February night, Richard left Clara's apartment in the Gold Coast district. Neighbors saw him leave. They saw Clara wave from the window. It would be the last time anyone saw her alive. Power. Betrayal. In Chicago, the three are never far apart. Richard Callahan thought he could control them. But what he didn't know was that the woman he loved would soon be the reason his empire crumbled. If you're still watching, don't forget to subscribe, because the next part of the mayor's affair takes us deeper into the scandal. And tell us, what city are you watching from? Because scandals like this aren't just Chicago's. They happen everywhere. Chicago wakes to rumors. In February of 1967, the city's newspapers ran with quiet hints. Mayor seen in company of singer. Mystery woman linked to City Hall. The headlines were cautious, too cautious to name names outright, but Chicagoans didn't need names. They already knew. Because in this city, secrets were currency, and once whispers started, they spread faster than fire in a steel mill. By spring, the whispers had grown into something darker. People were asking questions out loud. Who was Clara Duvall? Why was the mayor spending so many nights in the Gold Coast? And why did his wife suddenly look so cold, so tired, at his side during public events? It wasn't just an affair anymore. It was a scandal. Before we dive deeper, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. These are the stories power tried to bury. And tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? Because Chicago may carry this story, but scandal has lived in every American city. By March, Clara Duvall's name was being whispered in places she had once only dreamed of. Not in bright lights. Not on records. But in cigar-smoked backrooms and over whiskey glasses in the city council chambers. She wanted more. She wasn't content to be the hidden mistress of Chicago's mayor. She had tasted the luxury of his world, dinners at private restaurants, jewelry slipped into her purse, whispers of a future where she wouldn't have to stand on a nightclub stage just to pay rent. But Richard Callahan was no fool. He loved her, or at least he believed he did. But he couldn't give her more. He couldn't risk exposing himself. Not when the city was watching. And so, their affair turned sour. What had once been passion became arguments. Clara demanded more. Richard told her to be quiet. She threatened. He begged. And in that tension, the city's most powerful man began to unravel. Margaret Callahan had perfected the art of silence. At charity luncheons, she smiled. At ribbon cuttings, she waved. At church, she bowed her head. And at home, behind the tall stone walls of their mansion, she said nothing. But her silence was not ignorance. It was calculation. Margaret knew about Clara. She knew where her husband disappeared to at night. And she knew, as only a wife of 20 years could know, that he was falling, not just in lust, but in love. And so Margaret made a decision. If her husband could betray her in front of an entire city, then she would find her own form of revenge. Her affair did not start with passion. It started with convenience. A man in Richard's circle. A man who had always lingered too close, too eager to please. One of his political aides. Sharp, ambitious, younger. Margaret had no love for him. But she had power in his arms. And power was the only language her husband truly understood. In Chicago, nothing mattered more than the machine. The political machine that had fed generations of aldermen, cops, and mobsters. The machine thrived on loyalty and secrecy. And when the machine smelled weakness, it turned. By the spring of 1967, rivals in City Hall had begun to circle. Richard Callahan had ruled them with fear for years. But now, they saw opportunity. One rival in particular, Alderman Vincent Morelli, was quick to move. Morelli had his own ties to the underworld, his own ambitions for higher office. He began whispering Clara's name in the right ears. He began feeding the press tiny scraps of information, enough to make the mayor sweat. And soon, what had been an affair turned into headlines. Not yet explosive, but dangerous. For Richard, every day became a balancing act. He held rallies by day, kissed babies, gave speeches about law and order. And by night, he sat in Clara's apartment, begging her not to talk. But Clara wasn't afraid anymore. She knew she held the upper hand. She started keeping notes. Letters. Photographs. Proof of their affair. Proof of his words. Proof of nights they had spent together. Insurance, she called it. Richard called it blackmail. But Clara didn't care. She had finally found the power she had always wanted, and she wasn't going to let it slip. The breaking point came in May. One night, Richard and Clara left the nightclub together, slipping into a waiting car. They thought no one saw them. But a young photographer for a local tabloid had been waiting. One photograph, grainy, black and white, captured them together. It wasn't published immediately. Instead, it was sold. Passed quietly through the hands of those who wanted to bring Callahan down. When Richard saw it, his heart stopped. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was proof. And in Chicago, proof was fatal. Margaret Callahan saw the photograph too. And in that moment, something inside her hardened. She no longer wanted quiet revenge. She wanted blood. She began speaking with her lover in whispers. She began plotting. Not to protect Richard, but to protect herself. Because if her husband fell, so too would she. Their children. Their fortune. Their name. And Margaret was not a woman who intended to be dragged down by another's sins. By the summer of 1967, the city was boiling. Race riots shook the streets. Corruption scandals hit the police force. And through it all, whispers of the mayor's affair grew louder. Richard tried to bury it. He threw money at newspapers. He leaned on police captains. He called in favors from mob bosses. But it wasn't enough. The scandal had grown too big. And then, one night in July, everything changed. Clara Duval was found dead in her apartment. Her body on the floor. A glass of whiskey spilled. A bruise around her neck. The city gasped. And the first question everyone asked was the one Richard Callahan feared most. Where was the mayor that night? The scandal had gone from whispers, to headlines, to blood on the floor. And for the first time in his career, Richard Callahan wasn't the man in control. But if he thought the city would forgive him, he was wrong. Because the investigation had only just begun. And soon, suspicion would fall not just on the mayor, but on his wife. Scandal. Power. Betrayal. Chicago had seen them all before, but never like this. Richard Callahan thought he could bury the truth. But the truth always claws its way back to the surface. If you're watching, make sure to subscribe, because the next part, the investigation, will take us into the police files, the lies, and the cover-ups that shook Chicago to its foundation. And tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? Because the shadows of scandal don't belong to Chicago alone. They belong to every city in America. Chicago, July 1967. The city awoke to the news. Clara Duval was dead. It wasn't just another tragic headline. It was a bomb that detonated through the corridors of power, the smoky jazz clubs, the polished marble of City Hall, and the dark alleys where deals were made. Richard Callahan, the mayor, the man who had always been untouchable, felt the first real tremor of fear in his life. He had loved Clara, or thought he did. But now she lay lifeless in her Gold Coast apartment, and whispers of suspicion began to swirl like the wind off Lake Michigan. Before we continue, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. The stories we tell are more than headlines. They are the truths that power tried to bury. And drop a comment. What city are you watching from tonight? Because the kind of scandal that struck Chicago that summer could happen anywhere. Detectives arrived at Clara's apartment just after dawn. The building was quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards sound like a scream. Neighbors peeked from behind lace curtains, curious but afraid. Clara's body lay near the center of the room, a tipped glass of whiskey at her side, the bruise around her neck dark and angry. Detective John Halstead, a veteran of the Chicago Police Department, was the first to speak. "She didn't struggle much," he murmured. "This was personal. Someone she knew. Someone she trusted." The apartment smelled of cigarette smoke, perfume, and something else, the metallic tang of fear. And in that moment, one truth became clear. Whoever killed Clara had done so deliberately. By noon, rumors had already reached the press. Mayor's mistress found dead ran in the tabloid circles, small but deadly. Chicago was no stranger to political scandal, but this was different. This was sex, power, and murder rolled into one. Richard Callahan's aides were frantic. Lawyers were called. Public statements rehearsed. The mayor had to appear shocked, saddened, detached. Anything else would be political suicide. But privately, Richard knew the truth. People would believe what they wanted. And with Clara dead, there were now far too many questions, and far too many people with motives to answer them. Detective Halstead began piecing together Clara's final days. Who had visited her apartment? Who had called her? What messages were left on her answering machine? Every lead pointed to Richard Callahan. Every witness mentioned him. Hotel staff remembered him leaving late at night. Waiters at the club recalled him lingering longer than usual. And the photograph from the tabloid, once dismissed, suddenly became evidence of opportunity. But Chicago politics were never simple. Every officer knew better than to assume the mayor was guilty. Too many careers had been ruined by hasty accusations. Still, the smell of scandal hung heavy, and detectives Halstead and Ramirez knew they were standing on dangerous ground. Margaret Callahan had played her part perfectly in public, grieving, composed, supportive. But in private, she was a storm. She had a secret lover, one who had been loyal to her through the mayor's indiscretions, one who knew the political stakes, and one who could serve as both weapon and shield. Detectives were unaware of Margaret's involvement. But whispers in City Hall began to surface. Staffers noticed the strange glances, the meetings behind closed doors. Some speculated that Margaret might have had more to do with Clara's death than anyone could imagine. And the mayor, for the first time in decades, could do nothing to stop the wave building against him. By mid-July, the investigation became more than a police matter. Aldermen whispered about impeachment. Opponents seized the moment to push their campaigns. Journalists dug into every aspect of the mayor's personal life. Richard's political machine worked overtime, trying to contain the narrative. Lawyers negotiated quietly with reporters. Mob-affiliated aides smoothed over potential problems. Every move was calculated, but the scandal was like a virus. Once it spread, it was impossible to fully contain. Richard had controlled the city for years. He had bribed, charmed, and coerced. But this was different. This wasn't politics. This was lust, betrayal, and murder. And it was now public. Halstead's detectives interviewed everyone who could have been near Clara in her final days. A bartender at the nightclub remembered her arguing quietly with someone on the phone. A neighbor recalled a heated argument between Clara and a man in a dark suit, presumably Richard. Another neighbor noticed Margaret visiting the building days before Clara's death, though she claimed it was for a friendly chat. Every statement added pieces to the puzzle. Every answer deepened the suspicion. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was planned. Targeted. Personal. Richard spent hours pacing his private office in City Hall. He knew that the slightest misstep could end his career, maybe even his freedom. He called aides, friends, lawyers, anyone who could protect him. He considered leaving the city, disappearing into the Midwest, but that would make him appear guilty. He was trapped. And while he struggled to maintain composure, Margaret maneuvered quietly. She offered him counsel, guidance that was designed to keep herself safe. But she was playing her own game. She had learned long ago that power could be seduced, but it could also be stolen. By late July, the newspapers began running photos of Clara, the nightclub where she had performed, and the mayor himself. The city was captivated. Editorials questioned morality, leadership, and public trust. The scandal wasn't just political anymore. It was cultural. It challenged everything people thought they knew about the man in power, the sanctity of marriage, and the thin line between lust and danger. People whispered on street corners, in diners, and at factories. Chicago was alive with speculation. And every conversation, every glance, carried the weight of potential ruin. And then, the first arrest came, or at least, the first public accusation. A woman from Clara's circle claimed to have information that could implicate someone close to the mayor. Though she didn't name names, the implication was clear. The investigation was no longer only about the singer. It was about the mayor, his wife, and everyone who walked too close to power. Richard Callahan's empire trembled. Loyalty fractured. Secrets would surface. And the city watched, hungry, as the scandal deepened. Betrayal doesn't just destroy love. It destroys trust. It destroys families. And in Chicago, betrayal can destroy empires. The cover-up will reveal the truth behind Clara's death, the shocking roles of both the mayor and his wife, and the scandal that would haunt Chicago for decades. Chicago, August 1967. The city had held its breath for weeks. Headlines screamed. Politicians whispered in corridors. Aldermen and aides moved like shadows, calculating, waiting. And in the heart of it all sat Richard Callahan, once untouchable, now trapped in a storm of scandal, suspicion, and betrayal. Clara Duval was dead. The mayor was under investigation. And his wife, Margaret, once the quiet partner, had become the most dangerous player of all. This was the moment where power, lust, and vengeance collided. Before we begin, if you're still following the story, subscribe to the channel. These are the scandals history tried to bury, the betrayals people hoped you'd forget. And tell us in the comments, which city are you watching from tonight? Because power and desire can corrupt anywhere. Detectives Halstead and Ramirez had been working tirelessly. Every witness had been interviewed. Every hotel, nightclub, and apartment scoured for evidence. The first formal accusation was subtle. The mayor's presence at Clara's apartment the night of her death was undeniable. But proving intent? That was another matter entirely. Meanwhile, the city watched. Chicago's newspapers printed photographs of the mayor leaving Clara's apartment, lawyers in tow, and editorial boards speculating on murder, adultery, and cover-ups. Richard maintained his composure in public, but inside City Hall, panic surged. Every aide, every ally, was now a potential threat. The scandal had become bigger than Clara. It was now about who would survive the aftermath. Margaret Callahan had played the long game. The first weeks after Clara's death, she had remained publicly supportive, grieving, composed, the perfect image of loyalty. But privately, she was striking deals, gathering allies, and ensuring her position remained secure no matter what happened. Her lover, previously a minor player in City Hall, now became her instrument. Through whispers and discreet conversations, Margaret began planting the seeds of misdirection. The mayor's aides were misled. Detectives were fed partial truths. And journalists were quietly influenced. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was consolidating power. The mayor realized quickly that his career depended not on truth but on perception. He authorized discreet payments to journalists, quietly pressured witnesses to stay silent, and leaned on old mob connections to keep the press from digging too deeply. Every night was tense. Every meeting fraught with danger. One wrong word could destroy him. And all the while, Margaret was steps ahead. She understood the stakes, the players, and the fragile balance between exposure and survival. Detective Halstead had been patient, methodical, and frustrated. The city's whispers were loud, but proving Clara's death had been anything more than accidental or self-inflicted was complex. But new evidence emerged. Notes found in Clara's apartment suggested threats. Someone had been pressuring her. Surveillance from the nightclub indicated she had been followed after performances. A mysterious visitor had been seen entering her building hours before her death. All of it pointed toward someone close, someone who had both motive and opportunity. Richard's heart raced. Every clue seemed designed to trap him. Margaret's power became clearer as the investigation progressed. She subtly misled the police, pointing suspicion toward figures outside the immediate circle. She managed public appearances for Richard, ensuring the city saw him as grieving but innocent. She even manipulated witnesses, ensuring their statements would cast doubt on the mayor without implicating herself. By the time August rolled around, it was clear Margaret had not just survived the scandal. She was now controlling it. As pressure mounted, truths emerged in fragments. Clara had been ambitious, and she had confronted both Richard and Margaret. Margaret had her own affair, using it to protect herself and manipulate the investigation. The mayor had loved Clara, or thought he did, but his obsession had blinded him to the growing danger. The city watched as secrets unraveled, but no one knew the full story, except Margaret. She had calculated every move, every whisper, every lie, ensuring she emerged with power intact. The scandal left the city changed. The mayor remained in office, but his authority was diminished. Friends were gone, allies cautious, and enemies emboldened. Margaret emerged stronger than ever, her influence in City Hall quietly solidified. Journalists continued to speculate, leaving a permanent stain on Richard Callahan's legacy. Power had shifted. Lust had destroyed illusions. Betrayal had rewritten the rules. Richard had lost more than public respect. His marriage was a fragile facade, maintained only by mutual convenience. He had learned too late that love could be weaponized. And the city he had ruled for decades now whispered that he was vulnerable, human, fallible. Margaret, on the other hand, had survived. She had outmaneuvered both husband and mistress. And in doing so, she had claimed the most dangerous power of all, control over the narrative. The summer of 1967 ended not with justice, but with calculation. Clara Duval's death remained officially unsolved. The mayor retained his office, but the scandal would haunt him forever. Margaret Callahan walked through the streets with a quiet confidence, the secrets of Chicago under her command. And the city learned a lesson. In the dance of power, lust, and betrayal, it is not the strongest who survive. It is the smartest. Scandal, murder, betrayal. Chicago had survived another political storm, but the shadows remained. Richard Callahan learned the hard way that desire could destroy even the most powerful man. And Margaret proved that behind every great man, there may be a woman quietly rewriting the rules. Subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. And comment below, what city are you watching from tonight? Because the cost of lust and betrayal can be found in every city across America.